Welcome to the Sci-Fi Alien channel, where the unimaginable comes to life. Imagine being discarded by an all-powerful empire, your life deemed worthless, only to rise from the ashes and reclaim your future. What would you do if you were given a second chance at freedom? Will you fight for it, or will the past drag you back? Stay tuned to find out. Morgan had never been a man of many words. Life on the Last Word, his solitary ship, was about survival, simple, direct, and without complications. The ship was his only companion, its worn metal hull a constant reminder of his past choices. Years of drifting between the isolated outposts of the Rust Belt had hardened him. His days were spent repairing machinery, salvaging what he could from dead ships, and making sure his engines were always in working order. It was a life of quiet routine, until the Dominion decided to change it all. The message had come through his communications system late one night, crackling over the speakers like an unwelcome intrusion. It was brief and to the point, like all Dominion orders: transport assignment. Details to follow. Morgan had learned to ignore most transmissions. They were usually just bureaucratic nonsense, requests for a job, or a pass-through for shipments. But this time, something in the tone of the transmission made him pause. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt a shiver down his spine. When the cargo finally arrived, Morgan couldn't quite believe what he saw. It wasn't a box of parts or a container of supplies. No, it was something far more strange, more unsettling. A dropship from the Dominion had descended, its sleek gray hull gleaming under the dim light of the stars, a sharp silhouette against the backdrop of space. The air around the Last Word was filled with the hum of the engines as the ship touched down. Morgan watched it silently, his boots resting on the console as he absently chewed on the end of a carbon wire. He knew it wasn't just another delivery, it never was with the Dominion. The ship's hatch opened, and a figure emerged. At first glance, he couldn't make sense of it. The emissary, dressed in obsidian ceremonial armor trimmed with cold silver, moved with an air of cold authority. His helmet was tucked under one arm, his face unreadable, a glimmer of biocircuitry running along his skin like some sort of invasive design. Morgan's eyes narrowed. This wasn't a usual delivery. The Dominion didn't send diplomats to the Rust Belt. They sent soldiers, technicians, and sometimes, assassins. But this man? He was something else. Morgan, the emissary said, his voice cold and detached. The way he said Morgan's name, as though confirming a fact, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. You rendered unsanctioned assistance to Dominion officials 6 cycles prior. You saved the High Counselor's transport vessel. Morgan didn't move. His hand brushed the grip of his revolver beneath the navigation panel, his mind racing. He didn't ask for a medal, but he was hardly proud of the work. He was no hero, he was just a man who had been in the right place at the right time. But there was something in the emissary's eyes that told him this was more than just a simple thank you. The emissary gestured behind him. Floating just a few feet off the ground was a sleek stasis pod, hovering on a transport sled. It looked fragile, almost delicate in its design. The corners of the pod were chipped, the Dominion crest scarred and blackened, as if someone had tried, and failed, to erase it. Morgan frowned, trying to make sense of it. He could feel the tension in the air. Something was wrong. Take a look, the emissary said flatly. This is Cell. The pod rotated, and the lid hissed open. Inside, suspended in fluid, was a woman. Her long black hair drifted lazily in the amber liquid, her body unmoving, except for the occasional twitch of her limbs. The sight was unsettling. Her skin, a rich, dusky violet, was covered in biomechanical plating, elegant yet broken, sparking where neural lines misfired. Morgan's chest tightened as he looked at her. "Defective," the emissary continued, his tone indifferent. "Her service is terminated. Dominion law mandates that failed assets be recycled." Morgan's eyes flicked to the emissary. "Recycled?" he asked, his voice hardening. The word didn't sit well with him. He had seen his fair share of war and death, but the idea of throwing someone away like this, it made him sick. "Not to worry," the emissary said with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She's yours now. Dispose of her as you see fit. Entertain yourself, or simply let her die. It makes no difference to us." His words were cold, devoid of humanity. It was as though Cell's life held no more value than a piece of discarded equipment. Morgan felt his stomach twist. He didn't want to get involved, he never did, but something gnawed at him. He walked closer to the pod, peering inside at the woman. His fingers hovered near the console, uncertain whether he should disconnect her from the pod or just leave her to rot. There was something wrong about this entire situation, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being forced into a decision that would change his life forever. His hand brushed against the pod's control panel, and the fluid began to drain away, revealing more of Cell's body. She was frail, far lighter than he expected. Her skin was cold to the touch, slightly tacky from the cryofluid, but beneath the surface, he could feel the subtle hum of life. This wasn't just some broken machine. She was still alive, despite everything they had done to her. The Dominion had cut her open, reprogrammed her, and now they had thrown her away. The thought of it left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. "You're giving me a person," he muttered, the words tasting wrong as they left his lips. "No," the emissary said sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Not a person. A thing." The coldness of his voice made Morgan's skin crawl. He looked at Cell again, her delicate features twisted in unconscious pain. But there was something more in her expression. Despite everything, there was a flicker of hope buried deep within her, a reminder of the person she once was, or perhaps could be again. Morgan stood there for a long moment, staring down at the woman in the pod, trying to fight the wave of guilt that crashed over him. He hadn't asked for this, but he couldn't turn his back on her. He knew, deep down, that he couldn't just leave her to die. Not after everything. Without a word, he hit the emergency override. The pod hissed open, and he gently slid his arms beneath Cell's fragile body. As he lifted her from the pod, he felt the weight of the decision he had just made. There was no turning back now. He couldn't just fix her body. He would have to fix more than that. And he had no idea what that might cost him. The emissary was already gone by the time Morgan carried her into the spare room. The ship was eerily silent again, save for the faint hum of the cooling systems. Morgan laid Cell down on the padded surface, his mind still racing. What had he just agreed to? What did it mean to save her? And what would the Dominion do when they realized their prized creation had been stolen from them? But for now, all he could do was wait. He looked at Cell's unconscious form, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead of him. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he had a feeling that everything was about to change. Morgan sat beside the cot where Cell lay, the dim lights of the last word casting long shadows across the room. He had barely spoken a word since he carried her in, the weight of his decision still settling in his chest. The pod, the emissary's cold indifference, the words "dispose of her," it all replayed in his mind like a haunting. But as Cell lay there, still and fragile, Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that her fate was no longer in the hands of the Dominion. He had taken responsibility for her, and now the weight of what that meant was beginning to settle on his shoulders. It was strange, how quickly she had gone from an assignment, a burden, to something more. Cell's body, a patchwork of broken flesh and cybernetic limbs, was a constant reminder of the brutality of the Dominion. But beneath the cold metal, Morgan could see the faintest flicker of life, a spark of something that refused to die. She was more than just a failed experiment. She was a person who had been discarded, forgotten, but now, for some reason, Morgan couldn't ignore her humanity. As the hours passed, Cell's condition remained stable, her shallow breaths a reminder of the fragile line between life and death she now walked. Morgan leaned closer, his hand hovering over her cooling skin, uncertain of what he was supposed to do next. He had no medical expertise. He was just a mechanic, a drifter who had never asked to become anyone's savior. And yet, here he was, unwilling to walk away from the responsibility he had taken on. "Are you awake?" he asked quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost as though he were afraid to disturb the fragile peace in the room. Cell's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, the bright light from above making her wince. She blinked slowly, her vision adjusting as her consciousness slowly pieced itself together. "Where am I?" she murmured, her voice hoarse, weak from the sedation. Morgan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. "You're on the last word," he replied simply, trying to keep his tone neutral, though he could feel the unease stirring inside him. "You're safe. For now." Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to find something, some reason for the kindness he was offering. "Safe?" she echoed, her voice trembling slightly. I don't understand." Morgan stood and paced the small room, unsure of how to explain what he himself didn't fully understand. The ship was quiet, save for the hum of the cooling systems and the occasional squeak of the metal floor beneath his boots. He turned back to Cell, his mind racing. "You were left to die," he said bluntly, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "But I didn't want that for you." She didn't respond at first. The silence hung between them, thick and heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Cell's gaze drifted down to her hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she flexed them, testing the limits of her broken body. She hadn't moved much since he'd brought her aboard, and her limbs still seemed foreign to her, as though they weren't truly hers to control. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice quieter now. "Why did you help me?" Morgan's breath caught in his throat. He had asked himself the same question over and over since that moment he decided to override the pod's controls and free her. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. "Maybe because you're not just a thing. I couldn't just leave you there." Her eyes flickered with something like recognition, or perhaps relief, and then she closed them, as though the weight of everything was too much to bear. "They told me I was nothing," she whispered, her voice distant. "Just a weapon. A tool. They said I was broken." Morgan knelt beside her, careful not to crowd her, his gaze softening. "I don't see you that way," he said gently, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. "You're not broken. You're alive." There was a pause, and for a moment, Cell looked like she was going to argue. But she didn't. Instead, she simply nodded, as though the words had unlocked something deep within her. Something that had been buried for too long. Over the next few days, the changes became more noticeable. Cell's body, though still damaged and fragile, responded to Morgan's care. She began to move her limbs more deliberately, though at first it was small, hesitant motions. Morgan kept his distance, but always watched closely, ensuring that he didn't push her too far too quickly. One evening, as he sat at his workbench, fiddling with a broken circuit board, he heard the soft clink of metal on metal. He turned sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. There she was, standing, her legs trembling with effort as she leaned against the wall for support. She wasn't fully upright, her body was unsteady, each movement marked by a slight hesitation, but there she was, standing, fighting to keep her balance. "Sel," Morgan called softly, standing up from his chair and crossing the room. "Take it easy. You don't have to do this now." But Sel didn't respond. She simply focused on the task at hand, her eyes locked onto the far wall as she steadied herself, one shaky hand gripping the support beam. "I have to," she muttered through gritted teeth. "I have to move. I have to remember how." Morgan stepped forward, but he didn't touch her. Instead, he stood a few feet away, watching as she took a step, her knee buckling slightly but holding firm. Another step. Then another. Each one was slow, agonizing, but each one was a victory in its own right. When Sel finally collapsed onto the cot, gasping for air, Morgan moved closer, but again, he didn't touch her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and something else, pride, maybe. "I did it," she said, her voice shaky but full of quiet triumph. "You did," Morgan agreed, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, he saw her for what she truly was, not a weapon, not a broken thing, but a person who was fighting for her own life, fighting to reclaim what had been taken from her. In the silence that followed, Sel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her body was still trembling, her joints aching from the effort, but there was something in her eyes now, something new. A spark of hope. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And that, more than anything, made Morgan believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as broken as she had once thought. The days following Sel's small victory, standing, walking, moving, were filled with quiet determination. Morgan watched as she slowly adjusted to the reality of her new existence. The ship, once a silent and solitary place, was now filled with the quiet hum of effort, of two lives, one healing, the other recovering from its own ghosts. But as Sel began to regain control of her physical form, the true struggle began to reveal itself. It wasn't enough to heal her body. The real battle was within her mind, within the identity that had been ripped away from her. She wasn't just a broken weapon anymore. She wasn't just a casualty of the Dominion's cold, utilitarian system. But who was she now? What had been left behind when everything that made her human was erased and replaced with the cold touch of cybernetic parts? Morgan had given her a second chance, but now, more than ever, she needed to answer the hardest question of all: who was she beneath the broken armor? It was in the silence of the ship's corridors, late one night, that the question came to a head. Sel had begun moving more freely around the ship, though with a stiffness in her movements, a weariness in her step. She was still haunted by the way her limbs felt foreign to her, as though her body belonged to someone else. And each time she passed by a reflective surface, she caught a glimpse of herself, her face still strikingly human, but her limbs, her skin, no longer what they once were. She avoided her reflection, as if the sight of herself would remind her of the parts she could never get back. One evening, after Morgan had finished working on the ship's stabilizers, he found Cell standing in the small lounge area, her back turned to him. She wasn't looking out the window, where the stars painted the vast emptiness with their cold light. No, her gaze was fixed somewhere else, somewhere deeper. "Morgan," she said quietly, her voice so soft it took him a moment to realize she was speaking. He paused, uncertain whether to approach. It had been days since she had spoken this much. "Who am I?" The question hung in the air between them, too heavy to ignore. It wasn't the first time she had asked, but this time, it was different. There was a rawness to her tone, an openness that Morgan hadn't heard before. Her struggle to piece together her shattered identity was wearing on her, and the question, her question, seemed to tear at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Morgan stepped forward, stopping just behind her. His eyes fell on the reflection of her figure in the window, the dim light casting long shadows. "Your Cell," he said simply, but the words felt insufficient. "You're not the weapon they made you into. You're more than that." Her laugh was bitter, lacking humor. She turned slowly to face him, her expression blank. "More than that," she echoed. "I've been remade, Morgan. They took me apart, piece by piece. They gave me a new body, new parts, and told me who I was supposed to be. I was never asked. I never got to choose." He stepped closer, now standing right in front of her. His eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "But you're choosing now," he said, his voice firm. "You're choosing who you are now. No one can take that from you." Cell's gaze faltered, her eyes drifting to the floor. "I don't even know where to start," she murmured. "Everything I was, it's gone. Every choice I made, every part of me that used to matter, it's like it was erased. And now I'm left with this." She gestured vaguely at her body, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of her arm. Morgan's heart ached. He could see the pain in her eyes, the frustration of someone who had been denied the very essence of what made them human. He wanted to fix it, to give her the answers she sought, but he knew the struggle she faced wasn't something he could solve with simple words. "You're not defined by what they made you into," Morgan said, his voice softer now. "I know you've lost things. I can see it in you. But you're still here. And that means you can still choose what comes next." Cell was silent for a long time, her hands at her sides, her mind seemingly lost in the swirl of memories and pain that had haunted her since she awoke. Then, in a whisper, she spoke again. "What if the choice isn't mine anymore? What if I'm just the sum of what they did to me?" Morgan reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, careful not to overwhelm her with his touch. "Then let me remind you," he said gently, "you're more than just the sum of what they did to you. What they did was cruel. It was wrong. But what you do now, that's on you." Cell looked up at him then, her gaze unwavering. "I want to believe you," she said, her voice trembling. "But every time I try to figure out who I am, I feel lost." "I understand," Morgan replied. "I can't promise it will be easy, Cell. But I can promise you this, you're not alone. You don't have to face this alone." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, they both simply stood there, the weight of the conversation lingering like an unspoken promise. As the days passed, Morgan watched as Cell's struggle to reclaim her identity grew more intense. She wasn't just healing physically now, she was healing emotionally, confronting the parts of herself she had buried. Each conversation with Morgan, each moment of self-doubt, each small victory in regaining her confidence, added a layer of depth to who she was becoming. One morning, Morgan found her in the ship's galley, her hands steady as she worked to prepare a simple meal. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her in silence. For the first time since she had arrived on the last word, she seemed at peace, her focus, her attention, her movements all felt natural. "Are you sure you're still unsure about who you are?" he asked, his voice teasing, though it was clear the question was meant seriously. Sel glanced up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Maybe I'm starting to figure it out," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm not as broken as I thought." Morgan grinned, stepping further into the room. "I never thought you were broken," he said with quiet sincerity. "You just needed a little time to remember that you're more than what was done to you." Sel's smile widened, though there was still a hint of sadness behind her eyes. She wasn't fully healed, and she knew it. But she was starting to believe that the fight for her freedom, her identity, was worth it. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. And that, in itself, felt like a victory. The struggle was far from over. But with each passing day, Sel grew stronger. With Morgan by her side, she was starting to reclaim what had been taken from her, the right to define herself, to choose her path, and to believe that, even in the most broken places, there was still hope. As the days passed on the last word, the ship became more than just a refuge, it had transformed into a fragile haven, a place where Sel was not just healing physically but also beginning to reclaim what had been stolen from her. Morgan watched the slow but steady transformation unfold before him, the sharp edges of her past starting to soften. But in the stillness of the ship's quiet corridors, a new challenge loomed, a challenge that would test both their resolve in ways they hadn't anticipated. The Dominion had always been close. They were never truly gone, even if their presence seemed distant. Sel knew that. Deep within her, the remnants of their control were still embedded, like a scar that wouldn't fade. It was only a matter of time before they came for her. And as the days grew longer, Morgan began to feel the weight of that inevitable moment pressing on him, too. One evening, as the ship drifted through the silent void, a sudden alarm shattered the stillness. The proximity sensor lit up with an unmistakable red glow. Morgan's heart sank. The unmistakable shape of a Dominion reconnaissance vessel appeared on the radar, its cold, metallic hull gleaming in the distance. The patrol had arrived earlier than he had expected. And this time, it wasn't just a casual sweep, they were here for Sel. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the screen as the drone's silhouette loomed closer. The ship was still vulnerable, he had only made basic repairs, nothing that could withstand a direct assault. He knew what the Dominion would do if they found her. He'd seen it too many times before: elimination, disposal, and a return to the endless cycle of control. "Sel," he whispered, his voice tight with urgency. He turned to face her, his mind racing. "We need to go. Now." She was in the cargo hold, staring out at the stars, her face pensive. At the sound of her name, she turned to him, her eyes wide, sensing the tension in his voice. "What's happening?" she asked, standing quickly, her limbs stiff but growing stronger with each day. Morgan didn't wait for a response. "They're here," he said, his voice low. "The Dominions found us. We have to leave before they do." For a moment, Sel didn't move. The words hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of her past and the choices she now had to face. She had lived under the Dominion's thumb for so long, fighting, surviving, adapting, but what would happen if she ran again? Would it ever stop? Would she ever be free? But then, something shifted. Something inside Cell that had been dormant for so long, something she had been too afraid to fully acknowledge, stirred. She looked at Morgan, who was already preparing the ship, his hands working quickly to reroute power to the engines. "No," she said suddenly, her voice firm. "We don't run." Morgan turned to face her, startled by her resolve. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his tone sharp. "Do you want to die? They'll tear this ship apart. They'll." "I've been running all my life," Cell interrupted, her voice filled with quiet defiance. "They took everything from me, Morgan. And I let them. But not anymore. Not this time." Morgan was taken aback by the fire in her eyes. The woman who had once been a broken tool, a discarded weapon, was now standing before him, refusing to cower, refusing to hide. She wasn't just choosing survival anymore. She was choosing to stand and fight. "Cell, they won't hesitate," he said, his voice softer now, pleading with her. "You don't have to do this." "I don't care what they do," she replied, her jaw set with determination. "I'll fight for myself. And I'll fight for you, too. You didn't leave me to die. You saved me. You gave me a chance to be more than what they made me into. Now it's my turn to fight. To make sure they don't take that from me." Morgan stood silent, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had never asked for this. He never thought he'd be in this position, standing beside someone who was willing to risk everything, not just for their own survival but for something more. For freedom. For dignity. For the chance to choose who they were. But as he looked at her, standing there with her hands steady on the console, her body still shaking with the after-effects of the damage the Dominion had done, he knew she was right. She was no longer the broken soldier they had created. She was Cell, and she was finally taking control of her fate. The hum of the engines filled the air as Morgan turned back to the controls. His hands moved with a purpose, more certain than ever before. There was no turning back now. They were going to fight. They had to. For Cell, for himself, for the future they were trying to build together. The patrol vessel was getting closer. It wouldn't be long before they were within scanning range. But Morgan wasn't afraid. He had never been afraid of the Dominion, not truly. They had tried to break him, to make him into something they could control. But like Cell, he was no longer who they thought he was. He was his own man, and that was something they could never take away. "Ready?" Morgan asked, turning to Cell, his voice steady. She met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "Always." They moved quickly through the ship, preparing for what was coming. Morgan set up false signals, throwing off the Dominion's sensors. It was a trick, but it was their best chance. Cell, her hands trembling from both the effort and the fear, took the helm beside him, her gaze fixed ahead as she worked through the necessary adjustments. The ship shuddered under their combined efforts, the tension building with every passing second. As the Dominion vessel drew closer, the space between them growing smaller, the final moments felt like a lifetime. The quiet hum of the engines, the soft beeping of the instruments, the sound of their breathing, all of it seemed to stretch out in time. Then, the alarm blared. "They've locked onto us," Morgan said, his voice flat, his fingers flying over the controls. "Get ready." Cell didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She knew what she had to do. They had spent so many years fighting for their survival. But now, they were fighting for their future. And for the first time in Cell's life, she was fighting not just for herself, but for someone who had believed in her when no one else had. The Dominion might have the power, but they didn't have the heart. And for the first time, Cell was ready to show them what it truly meant to fight back. The moments that followed their decision to face the Dominion head-on were filled with a kind of stillness, the kind that comes right before a storm. The ship, the last word, hummed quietly as Morgan and Cell worked side by side, preparing for what was coming. There was no time to second guess, no space for fear. Everything they had fought for, every step, every breath, every choice they had made, had led to this moment. As Cell sat at the console, her hands steady as she manipulated the controls, she felt something she had never experienced before, a profound sense of clarity. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She wasn't just a victim of the Dominion's cruel experiments. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her path. Morgan's eyes flickered to her as she worked. There was something different about her now, a quiet strength, a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She wasn't broken. She wasn't a tool to be discarded. She was Cell, and she had chosen to fight for herself. "You ready?" Morgan asked, his voice soft but firm, the question carrying more weight than he could express with words alone. Cell glanced up at him, her face expressionless but her eyes sharp with purpose. "I've always been ready," she said quietly, her voice steady, though it trembled with emotion. "I just needed to remember that I had a choice." Morgan nodded. He had seen her struggle to reclaim that power, to dig beneath the layers of pain and control the Dominion had buried inside her. He had watched her fight her own doubts, her own fear, and now, he was seeing the result of that struggle, a woman who had taken control of her own destiny, even in the face of the most terrifying odds. "Then let's make sure we don't lose it," he said. The tension between them was palpable, but it was different now. It wasn't the tension of fear or uncertainty, it was the tension of two people who had chosen to stand side by side against everything that had tried to break them. The Dominion's vessel was drawing closer, its dark shape filling the viewport as they made their final preparations. The time for running had passed. There was no more hiding, no more trying to escape from what had been done to them. This was about making a stand, not just for survival, but for the right to exist on their own terms. Cell's fingers moved across the control panel, her mind focused on the task at hand, but her thoughts were racing. As the familiar hum of the ship's systems pulsed through the room, her mind drifted back to the days before Morgan had found her. Back when she had been nothing more than a tool of war, when every action, every thought had been controlled by someone else. It wasn't just the implants, the cybernetic parts. It was the way the Dominion had twisted her into someone she wasn't, someone she could never have been without them. But now, for the first time, Cell was choosing. She was choosing to fight, to live, and, perhaps most importantly, to reclaim what the Dominion had taken from her, the ability to make her own choices. "How does it feel?" Morgan's voice broke through her thoughts, his words pulling her back to the present. Cell didn't look at him immediately. Instead, she let the question settle in, feeling the weight of it. How did it feel to choose? To have the power to make decisions again? She closed her eyes briefly, letting the reality of the situation wash over her. "It feels." She began slowly, her voice low, almost uncertain. "It feels like I'm finally waking up. Like I've been asleep for so long, and now I'm seeing the world for what it really is. And it's terrifying, but it's also freeing." Morgan stood there, watching her with a mixture of admiration and concern. He had seen her struggle. He had seen her fight for control over her own body, over her own mind. But this was different. This was the moment where she truly understood the power of choice. "You've always had that power," Morgan said, his voice soft but firm. "You just had to find it again." Cell met his gaze then, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Maybe I needed you to remind me," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Maybe I needed someone to show me that it's okay to fight for myself." Morgan nodded, but before he could say anything else, the alarm blared, a shrill, ear-piercing warning that echoed through the ship. "They're here," Cell said, her voice suddenly sharp with focus. "They've locked onto us." Morgan moved quickly, his fingers flying across the console to adjust their course. The Dominion ship was close now, too close. There was no turning back. The tension was thick in the air, but in that moment, it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was something else. Something deeper. They were about to face the Dominion together, two people who had chosen their own path in a universe that had tried to control them. Cell's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the power levels. She was still fighting the remnants of the fear that had been instilled in her, the fear of being nothing more than a weapon again. But now, with each adjustment she made to the ship's systems, that fear began to fade. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a woman with a choice. "Get ready," Morgan said, his voice steady now, as if he had already made peace with what was about to come. "We'll do this together." As Cell tightened her grip on the console, she realized that she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't scared of what the Dominion would do to her. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of letting them take her power, of letting them take the one thing they had never been able to control, her ability to choose. The ship shuddered under the strain as Morgan made the final adjustments. The Dominion's vessel was closing in, its dark silhouette now filling the entire viewport. The moment of truth had arrived. Cell looked over at Morgan, her eyes steady and sure. "We're ready." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Then let's show them what happens when you fight for yourself." The Dominion had always tried to control her. They had tried to strip her of everything that made her human. But now, Cell was standing on her own 2 feet, fighting for her right to exist as she was, not as a weapon, but as a person. And in that moment, she realized that no matter what happened next, the power to choose her own fate had always been hers. And that, above all else, was the freedom she had been fighting for all along. The Dominion ship loomed ever closer, its dark silhouette growing larger in the viewport. The cold, mechanical hum of the last word seemed to intensify as if the ship itself were holding its breath. Cell stood by the console, her fingers poised over the controls, her eyes fixed on the approaching threat. The tension in the air was thick, but as she felt the weight of the situation, something deep inside her shifted. She wasn't the scared, broken weapon the Dominion had turned her into. No, she was someone who had found her power again, and with it, the strength to face whatever was coming. Beside her, Morgan was already preparing for the worst, setting false signals and rerouting power to the ship's shields. He worked with the practiced ease of someone who had fought for his survival for years, but this time, the stakes felt different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her. And that was something far more dangerous, far more personal. "You're sure about this?" Morgan asked, his voice laced with concern as he looked over at Cell. "We're not just running anymore, are we?" Cell met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "No," she said quietly, her voice firm but filled with a quiet strength he hadn't heard before. "We're not running anymore. We're standing our ground. Her words echoed in the silence that followed, a weighty statement of intent. For so long, Cell had been afraid of what the Dominion had done to her, afraid of her own identity, afraid of her own power. But in that moment, standing next to Morgan, she realized she was no longer afraid of losing herself. She had found a new strength in her choices, in her ability to decide her own fate. And with that strength, came a realization that she couldn't walk away from what was happening. Not again. Not this time. But Morgan was different. He wasn't just a mechanic trying to get by. He wasn't just a man with a broken past. He had chosen to fight beside her, to protect her, to keep her alive, even when it meant risking everything. In his eyes, Cell could see the price of his compassion. He wasn't just helping her out of a sense of duty or obligation, he had seen the darkness in her past, the pain that ran deeper than the cybernetics she wore. He had chosen to see her as more than just a weapon, more than just a tool. He had chosen to believe in her when she had been unable to believe in herself. But it was a dangerous choice, and Cell knew it. Every moment they delayed now, every decision they made, was a risk. The Dominion would not stop until they had her, until they had wiped away everything she had become. And if they couldn't take her back, they would burn everything in their path to make sure she didn't escape. The ship's proximity alarm blared, snapping Cell out of her thoughts. The Dominion was almost upon them. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned to Morgan, but there was no fear in her eyes anymore, only resolve. "Do it," she said. "Whatever you have to do. Just get us out of here." Morgan nodded, his jaw tight. He didn't look at her, didn't speak for a moment as he manipulated the ship's controls. He wasn't afraid either. His eyes were focused, but there was something there, something soft, something protective. The connection they shared was undeniable, and as much as he wanted to keep her safe, he knew the price of that safety. "Cell, if we survive this," Morgan began, but his voice trailed off as if the words couldn't fully express what he meant. "I need you to understand, I'm not just doing this for you. I'm doing this for us. You give me something to fight for." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. It wasn't just the weight of his affection that struck her, though that in itself was powerful, it was the raw honesty in his voice. He had risked everything already by choosing to stand by her. But now, with the Dominion closing in, he was giving her something far greater than she had expected. He was choosing to fight for their future, together. She looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you give me a reason to keep going." The words felt like they held everything, the gratitude, the fear, the understanding of what was at stake. She had never been able to say them before, not to anyone. But Morgan had made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, hope. Just then, the Dominion ship activated its tractor beam, pulling the last word in. The ship shuddered as it was forced off course, the weight of the pull feeling like a vice around them. Cell's hands gripped the console, her body tense with the pressure. Her mind raced, but the terror she had expected didn't come. Instead, she felt clarity. She wasn't going to run anymore. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to fight. "Morgan, we can't let them board us," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I know," Morgan replied, his hands moving with practiced precision. "But we're not just going to fight them. We're going to make them regret ever coming after you." Cell's eyes met his again, a spark of defiance in her gaze. "Then let's do it." The ship lurched again as the tractor beam's pull intensified. The sound of the Dominion ship's engines reverberated through the last word as the two ships were pulled closer together. There was no more time to think, no more time for hesitation. It was now or never. "Hold on," Morgan muttered, flipping switches and rerouting power. "This is going to be rough." The ship's hull groaned in protest as it was yanked forward. Sel's breath hitched, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she focused on the task at hand. She had made her choice. Now, it was time to see it through. The sound of the Dominion's boarding pods deploying came next, the low thrum of engines echoing through the corridors. But Sel wasn't afraid. She had made a promise to herself, and to Morgan. She wasn't going to be anyone's property again. Not ever. The Dominion might have the power, but they didn't have the heart. They didn't have the will to fight for something bigger than themselves. And in that moment, Sel realized the price of compassion. The price of standing up for someone else, of choosing to protect what you loved, was steep. But it was worth every second. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for the chance to live. And with Morgan at her side, she knew she would never have to fight alone again. The struggle was far from over, but in the wake of the chaos, something remarkable had begun to take shape. The Dominion had come for them. They had tried to break them, destroy them, but Morgan and Sel had stood their ground. Together, they had fought back, reclaiming the right to choose their own path. Now, as the last echoes of the battle faded, they found themselves not just survivors, but something far more powerful: they were free. As the last word drifted silently through the void, leaving the debris of their last confrontation behind, the weight of everything they had fought for began to settle in. The immediate danger had passed, but the journey ahead was still unknown. Sel stood by the cockpit window, staring out into the darkness, the stars shimmering in the distance. For the first time in years, she wasn't haunted by the past. There were no voices telling her what she was supposed to be. No commands. No constraints. Just the vast, open expanse of space, and the possibility of what could come next. Morgan stood behind her, watching her silently. He had known this was coming, known that Sel would eventually reach this point where she had to face the reality of what they had done, of what they had fought for. But seeing her like this, finally at peace with herself, was something he hadn't fully allowed himself to hope for. "You did it," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "You're free." Sel didn't turn to face him, but she smiled, a quiet, almost imperceptible thing. "We're free," she corrected, her voice steady and sure. Morgan chuckled softly, a sound that felt strange but real, like something that had been dormant for too long. "I'm not sure I've ever been free before," he admitted, stepping closer. "But with you, it feels like I have been." There was a moment of silence between them, filled only with the hum of the ship and the distant pulse of the stars. It wasn't awkward, just a quiet understanding that words couldn't fully express. They had been through so much together, both broken in their own ways, but here they were, standing, breathing, alive. And in that moment, it felt like everything had changed. Sel turned to face him, her eyes soft but unwavering. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of the question. Morgan looked at her for a long moment, considering. He had spent so many years running, hiding, avoiding the questions that came with the future. But now, with Sel at his side, with the world outside their ship wide open, those questions didn't feel so heavy. They felt like an invitation. Every day, he said finally. But I think for the first time, I'm ready to face it. Whatever it is. Cell nodded, as though something inside her had clicked into place. I don't know what comes next either, she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty but tempered with resolve. But I know one thing, no one is going to decide for me anymore. I'm the one who gets to choose. And that's a power I never thought I'd have. Morgan felt a knot in his chest loosen. He had seen her fight, seen her struggle to remember who she was, to believe that she had the right to make her own decisions. And now, here she was, claiming that power, and it was something that would change her forever. You've always had that power, Cell, he said quietly. You just needed to remember it. I'm just glad I could be here to see it. She gave him a small, genuine smile, her eyes meeting his in a way that felt like a shared understanding. You didn't just help me remember, she said, her voice soft but steady. You gave me a reason to believe in it again. The words settled between them, and for a moment, they stood there, the weight of everything they had been through making the silence feel heavy but not oppressive. They had both been broken in their own ways, Cell by the Dominion, and Morgan by the weight of his past mistakes. But together, they had rebuilt something stronger than the sum of their parts. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was redemption. For both of them. The quiet hum of the ship filled the space around them, and Cell took a deep breath, as though breathing in the newfound sense of freedom that filled the air. What do we do now? She asked, her voice steady, but with a hint of curiosity. Where do we go from here? Morgan turned away from her for a moment, his eyes scanning the stars outside the window, his mind racing. He had no plan, no roadmap for the future. They could go anywhere, be anyone. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. But for the first time in his life, he realized something, it didn't matter. They didn't need a plan. They didn't need anyone else's permission to live their lives. We go wherever we want, he said with a grin, his voice full of newfound confidence. We choose, Cell. That's what we do now. Cell's eyes flickered with something, relief, perhaps, or the lightness of finally being able to breathe without the weight of the past pressing down on her. She stepped closer to him, her voice quiet but resolute. Then let's go, she said simply. Let's see where this freedom takes us. Morgan nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The past no longer held them hostage. The future was wide open. And together, they had the power to shape it. As the last word drifted through the quiet expanse of space, Morgan and Cell looked out at the stars, each of them silently acknowledging the choice they had made, the choice to live, to be free, and to reclaim the power of their own redemption. There was no more running. No more hiding. There was only the future they were about to create together, a future built on their own terms. And that, above all, was the freedom they had fought for. The stars stretched out before them like an endless sea of possibilities, their cold light filling the cockpit of the last word. Cell sat in the pilot's seat, her hands steady on the controls, but her mind was far from the ship's systems. They had just made it out of the grip of the Dominion, a victory that felt as surreal as it was hard-won. But even as the engines hummed with the rhythm of their flight, Cell couldn't help but think about what it all meant. They had won. She had fought for her freedom, for her right to choose, and she had succeeded. But the price of that freedom was something she couldn't shake off. Every day of her life, she had been a pawn in someone else's game. Every choice had been made for her, every action dictated by a cruel hand. Even now, with the stars spread out before her, a part of her still felt as if she were walking through a dream, a world where she was no longer bound by the chains of the past, but still unsure of what to do with the newfound liberty that had been handed to her. Morgan sat beside her, his eyes on the viewport but his mind not far from hers. They hadn't spoken much since their escape, both of them lost in their thoughts, processing everything that had happened. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was a space they both needed to fill with their own understanding of the world they were now living in. A world that was theirs to shape. "How does it feel?" Morgan asked, his voice breaking through the quiet like a thread reaching out across a vast distance. Sel looked over at him, her gaze softening. She hadn't expected the question, but now that it was asked, it felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. "It feels like... I don't know," she began slowly, her voice soft with uncertainty. "Like I'm standing on the edge of something, but I can't see what's beyond it yet." Morgan smiled, a quiet, understanding smile. "You're standing at the beginning, Sel. This is just the start." The way he said it, so simple, so confident, made something inside her stir. She had spent so long fighting for this moment, for the chance to make a choice, and now that she had it, she realized that it wasn't just about escaping the Dominion. It was about what came next, the path she would walk, the life she would build. For the first time in her life, she could choose. "I've never been here before," she said, her voice a little more sure now. "I don't even know where to begin." Morgan turned his head to look at her, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. "You begin by choosing what you want. You've spent so much time being told who you were. Now, it's time to figure out who you want to be." The simplicity of his words struck her deeply. Who do I want to be? It wasn't something she had ever been able to ask herself. The Dominion had shaped her into something they could control, something they could use, and when they were done with her, they discarded her. But now, she wasn't just the sum of their manipulations. She was Sel. She was someone who had the power to decide what her life would look like. She leaned back in the seat, taking a deep breath, her hands resting gently on the controls. The stars outside seemed to glimmer with the same possibility that filled the air between them. She was free. And that freedom, though terrifying, was the most beautiful thing she had ever known. "Do you ever wonder what you would have done, if you had a second chance?" she asked quietly, her eyes drifting back to the stars. "If you could choose everything again, where would you go?" Morgan's gaze shifted, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, his voice low, he said, "I think about that a lot. I've lived a long time under the weight of mistakes I made, things I can't undo. But now, standing here with you, with a chance to really live, I think, maybe that's all we can ever ask for. A chance to make something new. To start fresh." Sel turned her head to look at him, his words hitting her like a revelation. She had spent so much time thinking that her life had been defined by her past, that she was just a product of what the Dominion had done to her. But Morgan was right. She had a chance to rebuild. To create something of her own, something that wasn't based on survival, but on living. And that thought filled her with more hope than she had ever known. "You make it sound easy," she said with a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "But I've spent so much time running from my past. I don't even know where to start." "You start by forgiving yourself," Morgan said, his tone sincere. "You don't have to be defined by what happened before. The power of redemption is that you get to choose what happens next. You're not your past, Sel. You're what you make of this moment." She nodded slowly, his words sinking in deeper than she had expected. The idea of redemption wasn't just about atoning for past mistakes. It wasn't about fixing what had been broken. It was about choosing to move forward, choosing to accept what had happened but not let it control her. She was more than the sum of the years spent in the Dominion's grasp. She was free. "We're both starting over, aren't we?" she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. Morgan smiled, the warmth in his gaze matching the quiet comfort of his words. "We are. Together." The ship drifted through the quiet void, the two of them now partners in a way that felt deeper than anything they had experienced before. There was no guarantee of what lay ahead. The future was as uncertain as the stars themselves, but in that uncertainty, there was something precious, something that neither of them had ever truly had before: hope. Hope for the life they could build together, hope for the choices they would make, and hope for the redemption they would find along the way. Sel leaned back in the seat, a feeling of peace settling over her as she watched the stars. For the first time, she was not just surviving. She was living. And that, she realized, was the truest form of freedom. It wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about choosing the future. And in that moment, Sel knew that no matter what came next, she would face it with the power of her own choice, her own voice. She had been broken. But now, she was healed. Extra chapter. It had been weeks since Morgan and Sel had escaped the clutches of the Dominion, their ship drifting freely through uncharted space. Life had taken on a new rhythm, one not dictated by survival or fear, but by choice. They had found a quiet corner of the galaxy to call their own, a small, uninhabited planet that had become their sanctuary. There, they had built a home, not just from salvaged ship parts but from the hope and healing that they had fought so hard for. The days had passed in a calm blur. The work was simple: repairing the ship, gathering resources, and learning how to live without the constant threat of being hunted. Sel had spent her time learning about herself, about what it meant to be truly free, and Morgan had quietly stood by her, offering his support without hesitation. They had both become something more than they were before, something better. But even in their new life, the ghosts of their pasts lingered, like shadows that refused to disappear. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their small house, watching the twin moons rise over the horizon, a sudden pulse from the ship's communication system broke the peaceful silence. The low, steady beep echoed through the quiet night, like a warning, a premonition. Sel's heart skipped a beat, and she exchanged a look with Morgan. "Did you set up any messages?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of unease. Morgan shook his head. "No. It's too quiet out here for anyone to find us. No signals should be reaching us." But the signal kept pulsing, relentless, drawing their attention. Morgan stood up, the calm expression on his face betraying none of the growing anxiety that Sel could feel crawling beneath her own skin. They had done everything to make sure they were off the Dominion's radar, everything to erase their presence from the universe. How could someone have found them? "Let's check it out," Morgan said, his voice low and calm, but Sel could see the unease hidden beneath the surface. They both knew it wasn't just any ordinary signal. The two of them made their way to the ship's control room, where the signal was now flashing brightly across the main console. Sel's hands hesitated over the controls, as if fearing what they might uncover. She had been so certain that they were beyond the reach of their pasts, that they had finally carved out a life for themselves in the untouched corners of the galaxy. But now, as the signal continued to pulse, she felt that hard-won piece slipping away from her fingers. Morgan leaned over her shoulder, his face close to hers. He didn't speak at first, just watched the signal blink on the screen. "It's Dominion," he said grimly. "I don't know how they found us, but this isn't good." Cell's breath caught in her throat. She had been so careful, so meticulous, in making sure they were hidden. They had left no trace, erased every possible connection to the Dominion. How could they have tracked them down? She glanced at Morgan, her mind racing with the possibilities. "What do we do?" Morgan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "We have two choices. We either cut the signal and hope they don't trace it back to us, or we answer it and see what they want." Cell looked at him, feeling the weight of the decision. "If we cut the signal, they'll come looking. If we answer, we're opening the door to whatever they have in store for us. Either way, we're risking everything." Morgan turned to face her, his eyes serious. "If we answer it, we might be able to control the situation. They've been searching for you. If we don't answer, they'll think we're hiding, and they'll come after us harder." Cell's hands shook slightly as she reached for the comm system. "Then we answer," she said, her voice tight. "We can't run anymore. I'm not hiding from them." The comm crackled to life, and a voice, cold, unmistakably Dominion, spoke from the speakers. "Designation, Cell 1A. Unauthorized activity detected. You are ordered to submit for reintegration or be terminated." The words struck Cell like a physical blow. She clenched her fists, her entire body tensing. The Dominion was still hunting her, still determined to erase her existence. She could feel the weight of their words, the familiar sensation of being nothing more than an asset to be discarded, an object to be used. But this time, something had changed. "I'm not coming back," Cell said, her voice low but unwavering. "You'll have to do more than that." Morgan watched her, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were filled with something, pride, perhaps, or admiration. This was the woman he had come to know, the one who refused to be a tool anymore, who had found the strength to fight back. The voice on the comm didn't hesitate. "Failure to comply will result in immediate termination. Resistance is futile." Cell's mind raced. This was it, the moment she had feared, the moment she had known was inevitable. They had been free for so long, living in peace, building something new. But now the Dominion had found them, and there was no going back. A strange calm washed over her. She wasn't the woman she had been when they first met. She wasn't a weapon. She wasn't a failure. She was Cell, and she had a life now, one that she had chosen. No one, not even the Dominion, could take that from her. "They'll come for us," Morgan said, his voice steady. "And they won't stop until they have you. We need to prepare." Cell stood, her legs steady beneath her. "I'm ready," she said quietly. "Let's face them. Together." The signal cut out abruptly, and the comms went silent. But the threat remained, hanging over them like a shadow. Cell knew what was coming. The Dominion would stop at nothing to reclaim her. They would send everything they had, and they wouldn't stop until she was back under their control. But this time, Cell wouldn't be a prisoner. She had already made her choice. She had already chosen freedom. "Whatever happens next, Morgan," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "I'm not running." Morgan nodded, a fierce light in his eyes. "Neither am I." And with that, they both knew, their past had caught up with them, but they were ready. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their future, for their right to be free.